Mr. Paul of Texas. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And I request permission to insert an article at the end of my statement.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, over a half a century has transpired since the United States of America became a member of the United Nations. Purporting to act pursuant to the treaty powers of the Constitution, the President of the United States signed and the United States Senate ratified the Charter of the United Nations. Yet the debate in government circles over the United Nations' charter scarcely touched on the question of the constitutional power of the United States to enter such an agreement. Instead, the only questions addressed concerning the respective roles that the President and the Congress would assume upon the implementation of that charter. On the one hand, some proposed that once the Charter of the United States was ratified, the President of the United States would act independently of Congress pursuant to his executive prerogatives to conduct the foreign affairs of the nation. Others insisted, however, that the Congress play the major role of defining foreign policy, especially because that policy implicated the power to declare war, a subject reserved strictly to Congress by Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. At first, it appeared that Congress would take control of America's participation in the United Nations. By the enactment of the United Nations Participation Act on December 20th, 1945, Congress laid down several rules by which America's participation would be governed. Among those rules was the requirement that before the President of the United States could deploy United States Armed Forces in service of the United Nations, he was required to submit to Congress for its specific approval the numbers and types of armed forces, their degree of readiness and general location, and the nature of the facilities and assistance, including rites of passage, to be made available to the United Nations Security Council on its call for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Since the passage of the United Nations Participation Act, however, congressional control of presidential foreign policy initiatives in cooperation with the United Nations has been more theoretical than real. Presidents from Truman to the current president have again and again presented Congress with already begun military actions, thus forcing Congress's hand to support United States troops or risk the accusation of having put the nation's servicemen and servicewomen in unnecessary danger. Instead of seeking congressional approval of the use of United States Armed Forces in service of the United Nations, presidents from Truman to Clinton have used the United Nations Security Council as a substitute for congressional authorization of the deployment of United States Armed Forces in that service. This transfer of power from Congress to the United Nations has not, however, been limited to the power to make war. Increasingly, presidents are using the UN not only to implement foreign policy in pursuit of international peace, but also domestic policy in pursuit of international, environmental, economic, education, social welfare, and human rights policy, both in derogation of the legislative prerogatives of Congress and of the 50 state legislatures, and further in derogation of the rights of the American people to constitute their own civil order. As Cornell University government professor Jeremy Rabkin has observed, although the UN Charter specifies that none of its provisions shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, nothing has ever been found so essentially domestic as to exclude UN intrusions. The release in July 2000 of the UN Human Development Report provides unmistakable evidence of the universality of the United Nations jurisdictional claims. Boldly proclaiming that global integration is eroding national borders, the report calls for the implementation and, if necessary, the imposition of global standards of economic and social justice by international agencies and tribunals. In a special contribution endorsing this call for the globalization of domestic policymaking, United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan wrote, "Above all, we have committed ourselves to the idea that no individual shall have his or her human rights abused or ignored. The idea is enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations' achievement in the area of human rights over the last 50 years are rooted in the universal acceptance of those rights enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Rights. emerging slowly, but I believe surely, is an international norm, and this is Annan's words, that must and will take precedence over concerns of state sovereignty. Although such a wholesale transfer of United States sovereignty to the United Nations, as envisioned by Secretary General Annan, has not yet come to pass, it will unless Congress takes action. H.R. 1146, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, is my answer to this problem.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
The video for January 24th, 2017 is entitled H.R. 193, American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2017. Is the United States Brexit coming anytime soon? Yes, Representative Mike D. Rogers from Alabama, who is on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has proposed just such a bill in Congress. Yes, I know Congress is still part of the phony and unlawful corporate government. But this indicates that there are those who want to get us out of the United Nations and restore national sovereignty. Hopefully, this is a sign of sweeping change, that will unseat the cabal and bring freedom back to this nation as presented in the original Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution. I hope this becomes a worldwide movement as people around the world work to unseat the criminal cabal and restore human rights for all of humanity. Of course, the bill is still must pass the House, the Senate, and the President before it can become law.
Well, the United Nations is freaking out as Donald Trump and Congress get ready to destroy them for good. This story from Aaron Moreno from Truth Feed reporting that the backstabbing of Israel by Obama, John Kerry, and the United Nations is not going unpunished. A bill was just introduced this month by Alabama Representative Mike Rogers. It's called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2017. God bless America.